Hello, so today I'm going to be doing a radiator on this 2000 Dodge Grand Caravan Sport. It's a 3.3 liter engine. Not a terribly difficult job. This radiator's been leaking for a little bit. Right here at the below the bumper, been noticing a drip here, and the lower and upper radiator hoses look good. So I'm suspecting that there's a problem with the radiator itself. So we're going to get in there and take a look. I imagine this job's probably going to take from start to finish. I don't work very quickly, so probably about 3 hours on this job between removing the old radiator and putting the new one in. The thing you want to do before you start this job is go ahead and disconnect your negative battery cable. It's a 10mm fitting there, so disconnect that and move that negative cable to the side. So now that we have the battery disconnected, the first thing we want to do is remove this plastic shroud here, and in order to do that, you've got a 10mm bolt here on this end, driver's side, one on the passenger side. Then you have 3 screws that have to be removed here, and then there is a screw here that has to be removed, and then one on the other side. If all this is not removed, you will break your plastic. So those screws at the ends have to be removed, and then you've got 3 of these plastic tangs that have to be removed here. And then once you remove all that, then this shroud piece will lift out, and then you'll have your radiator and your condenser underneath. They're going to be sandwiched together right there. These little tangs can be difficult to remove. What I like to do is, I know this is a cutoff tool for wires, but if you're very careful with it, you can slide this underneath the lip of that. And as long as you don't bear down on the handles too much, you know, like you're trying to cut something, you can grip underneath that pin and then just put a little bit of pressure. That was more than a little bit, and it'll pull out that way. Typically, the insert inside comes out. We need to go ahead and remove the assembly here that goes into the air intake, your hose, and then your box here. You're going to disconnect the hose here, remove these 2 10mm bolts, and then you're going to have 2 other fittings that you need to remove. There's another corrugated tube here that goes to your air cleaner box, and there's an 8mm screw there that you need to remove to loosen this clamp here on that corrugated hose. And then up top here, you've got another 8mm that you need to remove that from the air intake. And then that'll come out the way, and then you can remove your air filter box underneath. You have your air intake box and assembly out the way, you can go ahead and remove the air filter box. The filter's in here. It's just one 10mm bolt right here that goes into the rail, the frame here rather. And the box fits up in here. This is where the air comes in. This is just a flange. It just sits up in there, and then it has two feet down below that sit in rubber grommets. But this is the only connection right here, this 10mm, that you'll have to remove in order to be able to lift the air filter box out of the vehicle. At this point, you need to go ahead and remove your hood latch assembly here. You've got 2 10mm bolts you'll need to remove, one here, and then there's one underneath here. So if you remove those 2, and then you can just rest that to the side, it'll hang by its cable, and you can get that out your way, and then you can begin to work on removing this cross frame. In order to gain access to the radiator fans, the upper radiator hose, a couple of transmission hoses that we need to disconnect, the electrical connections to the fan, and to have some more room, we need to disconnect, or remove rather, this upper frame piece here, cross beam. In order to do that, we need to remove these 2 13mm bolts here. There's a 13mm bolt in the back that we need to remove. And then on the passenger side, we need to remove these 2 13mm bolts, as well as a 10mm bolt that connects the coolant reservoir to the framing piece right here. So that has to be removed. And then the overflow tube, or the fill tube from the reservoir that goes in here to the radiator, we need to disconnect the clamp here and remove the hose here and get it out the way so that we can go ahead and remove that frame piece from the vehicle. So now we're ready to remove this upper cross frame here. We've removed the bolts from it, and this will give us access to remove the radiator fans from the vehicle. So you can see that there's a rubber boot here on this side that the radiator mounting bracket sits in here up top. All right, so you can see I've got that lifted out there. That sits down there in that groove, and then that can be lifted out. And then I'll show you what it looks like completely out. So we need to remove the fans from the vehicle. In order to do that, you're going to take loose these two little retaining clips here. One on each side here. They're under a little tension. And then you're going to have to remove the bolt down here at the dryer bracket. Should be two 10 millimeter bolts there, another 10 millimeter bolt here at the radiator, bracket for the radiator up top. And then on this side, you're going to have two 10 millimeter bolts, one here and then one lower on a plastic flange. It looks just like this, that mount directly to the radiator. And then you're going to have to dislodge your red security tab here and then remove the electrical connection to the fan. And then you'll be able to pull the fan. At this point, you can go ahead and uninstall your dryer bracket that runs to your radiator. There's one 13 millimeter nut that goes on that bolt right there that is it's welded to the dryer. So go ahead and remove that nut, and you should be able to remove the bracket off of the dryer. Bolts that connect the condenser to the radiator. One bolt's here at the radiator cap right here, 10 millimeter, and then there's another 10 millimeter bolt here near the upper radiator hose. I like to put a 2x4 or wedge something in here to keep this plastic separated from the condenser and the radiator so that I've got more arm and hand room. But there are two other bolts that need to go back in. One down here by these AC lines. There's a little clip that you've got to thread another 10 millimeter bolt in there. And then on this side, you can see a little bit better. There's a clip right down there. So there's not a lot of clearance in these areas. So if you can't get your socket wrench in there, I'd recommend either a 10 millimeter ratcheting socket wrench like this one, or you can get your 10 millimeter stubby if you need to get in there because of the limited space, and go ahead and snug those back up. Or if you're in the process of removing them, use these tools for that. So at this point, you want to go ahead and disconnect your upper and lower transmission lines. If you got these type of clamps, just a flathead screwdriver, the top one, and then the bottom one down right here, little flathead screwdriver. Or if you've got the factory clamps, you may need a little pair of grip balls or needle nose pliers to get them off, because they'll be under tension. Going ahead and removing the radiator hoses from the radiator. So I've removed the top hose from the inlet to the radiator here, and there's the bottom hose down here. Now this hose runs to the water pump, which is basically underneath your AC compressor, almost directly underneath your AC compressor. But I've removed the clamp here on the lower hose, and I'm gonna go ahead and pull that off, and I should be able to remove the radiator from the vehicle. All right, so at this point, I've got the radiator pulled out the vehicle, and you can see the condenser is just sitting there. None of the air conditioning system lines need to be removed. So having pulled the radiator out the vehicle, I've been taking a look, and you can see this antifreeze trace here. Hope you can. Some of the metal in here has gotten a little bit brittle, and I must have had some small leaks where the antifreeze was trickling down the side here of the fins next to the end cap. So definitely needed to be changed. So on this particular vehicle, the inlet and outlet are on the passenger side of the radiator. Here's the top of the radiator, and then the bottom, and these are your inlet and outlet. Then on the driver's side, you're going to have your transmission line fittings. You've got one at the top of the radiator, and I've already taken out the one at the bottom. That's where the petcock was right there. And then I'd encourage you to remove these clips. You might need to transfer those over to the new radiator when you go to mount it. I'd also encourage you to remove your cap. Keep your radiator cap as long as it's in reasonably good condition. And then you're going to need, depending on the type of new radiator that you got, some of them come with the new transmission line fittings. Other, you're going to have to transfer those transmission line fittings to to the new radiator. And so on that threaded fitting, in order to remove that from that port inside, you see right here, you've got on both sides of the fitting, those surfaces are flat. Again, just take your crescent wrench and you should be able to loosen and remove that fitting from that internal port. New radiator, I got this off of Amazon. I think the radiator was around $100. Fortunately, this one comes with a set of new clips as well, so I don't have to worry about transferring those old clips to the new radiator. And then the fittings here, I've just got them in hand tight, but you've got the upper and lower transmission fitting that you're going to need to thread in there, and then just tighten them up lightly with your crescent wrench. At this point, you just want to double check your petcock here. Just make sure that it's seated correctly. The O-rings look good. You might want to pull it and then reinstall it. And then on the transmission lines, I decided to go ahead and put a little bit of Teflon tape around here just to prevent any transmission fluid leaks. I'm going to put Teflon tape on the lower fitting as well. Another thing you're going to need to transfer from the old radiator to the new one are these little rubber supports that go on the bottom pegs of the new radiator. So they're going to situate right there, and there's going to be one on each side. Just make sure that the radiator is level and properly supported, and probably also prevents a little excess vibration. And those supports, cups, boots, whatever you want to call them, fit down here inside the front frame to elevate the radiator a little bit. At this point, I went ahead and reconnected the upper and lower transmission hoses to the fittings. When you do this, you just want to make sure that you don't over tighten your clamps. Also, try to orient the clamps so that if you ever have to remove the hose, replace the hose, or take out the radiator again, you orient the position of the clamps in a way that you can get back to those fittings pretty easily to remove them. If you've got them on the underside, sometimes it's real difficult to go up from underneath and remove a hose, so I'd encourage you just to orient the head here so that you've got good access to it next time you have to. I had to go ahead and replace the lower radiator hose as part of this job, and you can see some of the rubber around the top there. It's kind of mushroomed and compromised a little bit, so that clamp was probably on there a little too tight, so I'm gonna go ahead and replace it. Also there in the bend, when I flexed it over, some of the rubber looked like it was compromised, had some kind of deep grooves there. So yeah, $16 at O'Reilly is what I paid for the new hose, so I'm gonna go ahead and replace that along with some. So the majority of the time before I install a new hose, I like to go ahead and orient my clamps pretty much any hose installation. So this is the end of the lower radiator hose that goes to the water pump. Water pump sits up top, and then this is the end of the hose that's going to go into the lower radiator outlet. So the orientation will be, if you're directly underneath the car, this fitting right here is going to be looking right at you underneath the water pump, so easy access if I ever have to replace that water pump or disconnect this hose again. And then I'm going to have this one oriented like so. So the radiator will sit in front here, and I'll have access from above if I need to loosen this and remove this lower radiator line again from the radiator. So here's the lower radiator hose reinstallation at the water pump. You want that clamp just above the lip on the water pump outlet. There's a metal lip there. You want to be just above that when you reinstall that clamp. The lower radiator hose is on, and you can again see the orientation of the adjustment for that hose. You don't want to over tighten those clamps here at the inlet and outlet, because this is just fairly cheap plastic. And again, you just want to snug those hoses on and then put your clamp in between the lip here and the guide here. So now I've got my upper radiator hose back on and the clamp tightened up. So now we're going to reconnect or remount the condenser back to the radiator, and you're going to have the bolt up top here, and then where the clamp, you can see that silver tang down there. There's going to be another bolt that goes in there, and on the driver's side of the radiator, you've got the top bolt here, and then I don't know if I'm gonna be able to, yeah, then you've got the silver clamp down there, and there'll be a hole there to thread the bolt in there to attach the condenser to the radiator. When reinstalling the lower bolts holding the condenser to the radiator in, you can lift out the radiator from the frame where the boot goes down in the frame. You can lift it out a little bit and push it back to give you a little bit more clearance to put in the bolt on the 10mm bolt on the driver's side. I would not suggest you do that on the passenger side, however, because you could damage your air conditioning lines here or your accumulator dryer. Reinstall your dryer bracket at this time, but just hand tighten the nut there at the stud, because you're still going to have to attach your fans, and they're going to be two 10mm bolts that go in through this side of the bracket into the flange here on the radiator. So just hand tighten it at this point, and then you can snug everything up once you have your fans. All right, so I've set the fans back into the vehicle. You've got the two fans here, and I've taken care when I put them in there that I didn't damage the interior of the radiator. I don't want to mess up any of my fins here. So when you look, you've got a couple of plastic flanges here that mount to the radiator. You need a 10mm bolt here. There are two there at the dryer bracket. And that's why I said just put that dryer bracket in hand tight, because the fan set actually slides in between the radiator bracket and then the dryer bracket there, and then the two 10mm bolts pass through there. And then on the driver's side of the fans, you've got your connection here that you'll have to hook back up at this lead, and then you've got a couple of plastic flanges here, one up top and then one lower there, that two 10mm bolts go through to mount the driver's side of the fan to the radiator. So at this point I've got everything back that needed to be put back in to mount the fan back. The two 10mm bolts on this side to secure it, top and bottom, and then on the other side here, the two 10mm bolts down there, and then the one up top here. And then I had to reconnect the wiring harness here to electrify the fans. So fans are back in. Failed to mention that there are two little tabs here. They're under a little tension here, and they clip here on some little metal flanges here on the radiator. There are two of them. So when you remove your fan, just make sure that you keep track of those. So now that I have the radiator fans put back in, I went ahead and put back in the upper framing piece here. Again, two 13mm bolts here, one in the back, and then there are two bolts on this side, and make sure you put your 10mm back in to hold your reservoir to the back of the frame. Also thread your hose here from the reservoir to the radiator. Make sure you get your clamp tightened up here, and then go ahead to have these tabs, and you can feed that hose under there so that the hose stays secure on its run there. But make sure you get that hose put back in as well. Now that we've got the cross frame back in the vehicle, it's time to reinstall the hood latch. So again, two 10mm bolts, just thread those back up in there and remount your go ahead and put our air filter box back in. Just take the 2 feet, snug them down into the rubber boots underneath the little flange there with the 2 rubber boots. Go ahead and slide those 2 feet down in there, and then push the air filter box back in so it mates up here with the tube for the incoming air, and then put your 10mm bolt back in. And now we've got the air intake assembly back in. We tightened up that 8mm fitting, the one underneath at the corrugated tube here that flows into the bottom of it, as well as the two 10mm bolts here, and then the hose. Do not over tighten these bolts. You can see someone at some point did, and it'll cause that plastic to crack, and then at some point you might have to get another one. So don't ever over tighten bolts or nuts that are in contact with a plastic surface. So now I've got the shroud reinstalled. I've got the two 10mm bolts at the ends, the 3 screws up top, the 2 screws that are on the very ends here through the plastic, and then the 3 retaining tabs, have all those back in, and then I put my my cable to my hood latch, secured it back. So now I've got my battery reconnected, and now all that's left to do is go ahead and pull the radiator cap and refill the system with a 50-50 solution of antifreeze and water. So I ran the van a little bit, went ahead and topped off the antifreeze, and everything ran fine. Ran it up to operating temperature. Just wanted to make sure I didn't have any leaks. Checked underneath. Everything looked good. I also checked my upper radiator hose here. Just wanted to make sure that it was hot, so that to ensure that my thermostat was opening properly. So that was good. So that concludes this job. Hope it was helpful, and appreciate y'all watching. Have a good day.